3 men crossed the fence at midnight. They laughed at the sign. That was their first mistake. And somewhere up in the dark above them, between 2 fallen pines on the high ground, wrapped in a blanket the color of dead bark, still as the granite beneath her, something watched them make it. No sound, no movement, just eyes. Montana Territory, November 1883. A mountain the locals called cursed. 4 men had tried to hold this land before. None of them came back down the way they went up. The elk tracks near the upper spring were fresh. The 3 men found them and got excited. They forgot to ask why the elk had stopped moving. Then 3 shots, 3 angles, 3 seconds apart. Not at them, not yet. The biggest man hit the ground. The second ran 2 steps and stopped because something told him that direction was also a bad idea. The third one put his hands up. Smart, not smart enough. A voice came out of the dark. Calm, quiet. The kind of calm that doesn't need to explain itself. You just made the last mistake of your hunting season, gentlemen. They never saw her. They came in at midnight. 3 of them, moving through the tree line like they owned it, which, in their minds, they probably did, because nobody owned Harrow Ridge. Not really. 4 men had tried to homestead that mountain in the last decade, and every single one of them had disappeared, without so much as a boot left behind. The locals called it cursed. The men in the saloon called it a graveyard with trees. The land office in Helena had stopped trying to sell it entirely because the paperwork kept coming back blank and the buyers kept not coming back at all. So 3 men with rifles and a pack mule full of gear figured it was open season. Literally. The elk population on Harrow Ridge was something out of a fever dream. Untouched for years. Big bulls that had never once heard a human footstep. Easy money if you could get the hides to market before the snow locked down the passes. And tonight the sky was clear and cold, and the moon was just bright enough to move by. They crossed the fence at the eastern boundary. Didn't even slow down, because there was a fence now. Hadn't been a fence 6 months ago, but someone had strung barbed wire along the ridge perimeter over the summer and nailed wooden signs to the posts. The signs said private land, no hunting, no trespassing, and at the bottom, in letters smaller but somehow sharper than the rest, Callard. The biggest of the 3 men laughed at the sign, low, under his breath, the kind of laugh that isn't really amusement, more like contempt wearing amusement's coat. He stepped over the wire and kept walking. The other 2 followed, and that was the last easy decision any of them made that night, because she had been there since 10 o'clock, 2 full hours before they arrived, sitting in the dark between 2 fallen pines on the high ground above the eastern fence line, wrapped in a wool blanket the color of dry pine bark, completely still in a way that most human beings are not physically capable of being. The kind of still that isn't patience exactly, more like the absence of urgency, like the mountain itself had decided to hold its breath, and she had simply decided to hold hers with it. She watched them cross the fence. She watched them move through the lower meadow. She counted their steps, tracked their formation, noted how the biggest one walked point, and how the one on the left kept drifting wide nervous habit, probably, or maybe a bad knee, and how the third one kept glancing back the way they came like part of him already knew this was a mistake. Smart part. Not smart enough, but smart. She let them walk for another 40 minutes. Let them get comfortable. Let them find the elk tracks near the upper spring and get excited about it. Let them forget that comfort on someone else's land is just trespassing with extra steps. And then she moved. No sound. Not even the snow compressed differently under her boots. Just a shadow separating itself from other shadows and repositioning to a point 200 yards north. Then 3 shots. Not at them. Not even close to them. 1 into a tree trunk 6 feet to the left of the lead man. 1 into the ice on the spring where they'd stopped. 1 straight up into the black sky above their heads, so the muzzle flash lit up the tree line like a photograph. 3 different angles, 3 seconds apart, because she wanted them to understand they were surrounded before they understood they weren't dead. The biggest man hit the ground. The nervous one with the bad knee ran 3 steps toward the tree line, and then stopped because a 4th shot, this one just a branch cracking above his head, barely a whisper of a thing, told him that direction was also not a good idea. The 3rd one put his hands up. Smart man. Silence. Then a voice came out of the dark. Not loud, not angry. So calm it was almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. You just made the last mistake of your hunting season, gentlemen. Pause, leave the rifles. Leave the mule. Walk back to the fence the same way you came in. And if I see any of you on this mountain again, I'll make sure the only thing you're hunting is a good doctor. Nobody moved for 4 full seconds. Then the biggest man, the one who had laughed at the sign, stood up slowly. Found the dark with his eyes. Found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Just trees and shadow and cold air and the distant sound of the wind coming off the upper peaks. He left the rifle. All 3 of them left their rifles. They left the mule. They walked back to the fence without a word. Climbed over and disappeared down the mountain in the dark. The walk back to town would take them 4 hours. 4 hours to think about what just happened. 4 hours to try to explain to themselves why 3 armed men in their prime had just been sent running by something they never even saw. The mule didn't move, just stood there in the meadow, resigned in the way that mules tend to be about the general insanity of human beings. She stepped out of the shadows and took the lead rope. "Come on then," she said to the mule. Not unkindly now. "Let me back up, because you need to understand who that woman in the dark actually was. Not just what she could do, but why she was on that mountain at all. Why she bought 4,000 acres of land that 4 men before her had died trying to hold. Why she strung barbed wire for 3 miles alone in the August heat, with no help and no explanation offered to anyone who asked. And people asked, believe me, people asked. The story doesn't start on Harrow Ridge. It starts about 1,500 miles south, and 5 years earlier in a town in Texas that no longer exists, with a man named Wren Callard, who was the best shot anyone in 3 states had ever seen and the worst judge of his own mortality that anyone had ever met. Her name was Wren Callard, 26 years old as of the previous March, 5 feet 3 inches tall on a good day with the right boots. Hair the color of dark rust, not red, not brown, something in between that changed depending on the light. Green eyes that people remembered long after they forgot everything else about her face. A jaw that suggested she had opinions, and a set to her shoulders that suggested she was accustomed to people not caring about them. She had been making her way through the world since she was 21 years old, without anyone to catch her if she fell, and she hadn't fallen yet. Not because the world hadn't tried, it had. The world had taken her mother when she was 6, and her father when she was 21, and her husband when she was 21, and her husband when she was 24, and somewhere in the arithmetic of all that loss there should have been a breaking point. Should have been a moment when Wren Callard sat down on the floor and decided that enough was enough, and that getting back up simply wasn't worth what it cost. That moment never came. Not because she wasn't tired. She was tired. But tired and broken are different countries, and she refused to cross the border. She arrived in Ridgeback Creek, Montana Territory, on the 2nd day of September, 1883, on a wagon she'd driven 300 miles herself from the rail terminus at Billings, with a single trunk of belongings, a horse named Soot, and a Colt single-action Army revolver that had belonged to her father, and a Winchester Model 1873 rifle full that had belonged to her father's father, and an expression on her face that suggested she was done explaining herself to anyone about anything. Ridgeback Creek was not an impressive place. About 300 residents, give or take whoever had moved on that particular week. One main road of packed dirt that turned to mud in the rain and cracked like old skin in the dry months. 2 saloons. A general store run by a man named Pettiford, who weighed everything twice and charged for it once and somehow made that feel like generosity. A church with a cross that leaned slightly to the left. Blacksmith. A doctor who was also the barber. A land office staffed by one perpetually overwhelmed clerk named Eugene, who wore the same vest every day of his working life and had the look of a man counting down the years to something better. And a dressmaker's shop run by a widow named Mrs. Aldridge, who needed help with the alterations and didn't ask too many questions. That last part was the important one. Wren took the job, took the small room above the shop that came with it, introduced herself to exactly as many people as necessary and not one more. Said she was a widow from Texas. Said her husband had been a surveyor. Said she was looking for a fresh start. All of that was true. All of it was also incomplete in ways that would have changed how people looked at her if they'd known the rest. The people of Ridgeback Creek were curious about her. Of course they were. A young woman, alone, no family, no connections to the territory. Just showed up one September morning and slotted herself into the fabric of the town like she'd always intended to end up there. The women were politely suspicious. The men were something more complicated, and one man in particular was neither suspicious nor complicated about it. He was simply watchful in the precise and calibrated way of a person who makes decisions based on information and prefers to collect that information before making himself known. His name was Aldous Brent, 55 years old, owner of the Brent Consolidated Land and Mining Company, which was the kind of name that was designed to sound like several things at once without being specific about any of them. Member of the Montana Territorial Council, donor to the Church Restoration Fund, sponsor of the annual cattle auction, known in every saloon from Helena to mine of his word, which was true. Technically, he was a man of his word. The problem was what his word was worth. He had been at the land office the day Wren signed the papers for Harrow Ridge, reading a newspaper in the corner chair, not looking up, but his hand had stopped turning the page the moment Eugene read the property description aloud, and it had stayed stopped for the entire transaction, and only resumed turning when the door closed behind her. He folded the newspaper, set it on the side table, and sat very still for a moment in the way of a man who has just learned that a problem he thought was solved has become a problem again. The story of Harrow Ridge and why Aldous Brent cared about it more than he wanted anyone to know goes back to 1877. That year, a survey crew working the preliminary routes for the Northern Pacific Railroad moved through the mountain ranges of central Montana Territory. The Northern Pacific was the grand ambition of the era, a transcontinental line that would connect the Great Lakes to Puget Sound and open the entire Northwest to commerce and settlement. It was also, like most grand ambitions, running significantly behind schedule and over budget, which put enormous pressure on the surveyors to find the most viable route through extremely unforgiving terrain as quickly as possible. One of the civilian scouts attached to that survey crew was a man named Wren Callard, Texas Ranger, retired, 43 years old, the kind of man who had spent 20 years moving through hostile country at the sufferance of no one, and had developed, as a result, the particular skill set of someone who survived by being more observant than the people around him. He could read a landscape the way a scholar reads a page. Could tell you where the water was, where the high ground was, where a man might hide or be ambushed. Could track anything that moved through terrain that most people would have called trackless. The railroad paid him to find routes. He found them. But Wren Callard had a habit that the railroad did not pay for and did not know about, which was noticing things that had nothing to do with his assignment. What he noticed in the summer of 1877, in the rocky slopes of the mountain that the locals called Harrow Ridge, was a vein of quartz in a particular canyon wall that caught the light wrong in an interesting way. He stopped his horse, got down, took a rock hammer from his saddlebag, chipped at the wall for 20 minutes. What came out of that wall told him, in the vocabulary of a man who had spent time in the silver camps of New Mexico and had learned what to look for, that there was likely a significant deposit of silver ore beneath that mountain. Significant enough to matter, significant enough to make someone very rich. He wrote it in his field notebook, all of it, the location, the depth of the vein, the estimated extent. He drew a map. He noted the legal situation. The land was unregistered territory, not yet claimed under the Homestead Act, sitting in a kind of administrative limbo between federal oversight and the slow grind of territorial government that hadn't gotten around to cataloging it yet, which meant that whoever filed the right paperwork first would own it. He kept the notebook in his saddlebag. He didn't tell the railroad. He did, however, mention it to one other person, a man he'd worked with briefly in New Mexico 5 years before, a man he considered, at the time, to be trustworthy. He was wrong about that. The man's name was Aldous Brent, and Brent was not yet the powerful figure he would become by 1883. In 1877, he was a minor partner in a land speculation company with ambitions that significantly exceeded his current means. He had money, not enough. He had connections, also not enough. But he had patience, which is a kind of currency that compounds over time if you invest it correctly. He heard what Harlan told him about Harrow Ridge. He smiled. He shook Harlan's hand, and then he began the slow, quiet work of positioning himself to take that mountain without Wren Callard knowing it was happening until it was already done. The thing about Wren Callard is that she was not a woman who advertised herself. In Ridgeback Creek, she was the quiet one, the one who did her work well and spoke when spoken to and otherwise kept her own counsel. She learned the names of the children who came into Mrs. Aldridge's shop. She learned the names of the horses tied outside the general store. She learned the schedule of the mail wagon and the habits of the 2 saloon keepers, and the particular creak of the 3rd board from the top of the stairs in the boarding house next door. She learned things. That was what she did, because her father had taught her that information was more valuable than ammunition, and that the most dangerous person in any room was not the loudest or large, but the one who had been quietly paying attention since before anyone else arrived. Wren Callard had taught her many things. He had started when she was 9 years old, and the teaching method was direct and practical, in a way that most fathers in 1866 would not have considered appropriate for a daughter. He stood her in the yard behind their house in Laredo and put a Colt Navy revolver in her hand, too big for her hand, heavy enough to make her wrist tremble, and said, "This is not a toy. It is not a decoration. It is a tool. The way a hammer is a tool. You learn to use a hammer correctly, you build things. You learn to use this correctly, you protect things." She had stared at the gun, then at him. "What am I protecting?" "Start with yourself," he said. "Work outward from there." By the time she was 13, she could outshoot every boy in Laredo. By 15, most of the men. By 17, she had stopped keeping score because there was no one left worth keeping score against. She didn't brag about it, didn't perform it. Kept it the way her father had taught her, to keep most useful things available but not displayed. Because, as Harlan had also taught her, the gun you advertise is the gun someone makes a plan around. The one they don't know about is the one that ends the argument. She'd also learned to ride, which in Wren Callard's curriculum meant something considerably beyond sitting on a horse and pointing it in a direction. It meant reading a horse, understanding what it was telling you through the set of its ears and the tension in its back and the particular way it breathed when something in the environment was wrong before you'd noticed it yourself. Harlan believed that a good horse and a good rider were one system, not two, and that the rider's job was to shut up and listen as much as to give direction. Soot was not a beautiful horse, gray as old ash, built for endurance rather than elegance, with a broad head and a placid expression that people tended to underestimate. But Soot was smart in the particular way that mattered most, which was smart about people. Smart about who was safe and who wasn't. Smart about terrain and weather in ways that suggested some kind of intuition that Wren had long since stopped trying to explain rationally. She trusted Soot more than she trusted most human beings. Given her recent experience with human beings, this was not as eccentric as it might sound. She bought Harrow Ridge on a Tuesday, September 12, 1883. The conversation at the land office was brief because Wren had decided in advance that it would be brief. Eugene the clerk had looked at the paperwork, looked at her, looked at the paperwork again, with the specific expression of a man who wants very badly to say something cautionary, but is not technically authorized to make recommendations about land purchases. "Ma'am," he said, and then stopped. "Yes, this particular parcel." Another pause. "Harrow Ridge, it's called." "I know what it's called. There have been some, that is to say, 4 previous homestead claims on this acreage, and none of them where the claimants are no longer." "The deed," Wren said. "Is it legally available?" "Yes, but is there an existing encumbrance I should know about?" "No, but is the boundary survey on file?" "It is, but..." She put $740 on the counter in cash, which was, to be precise, every dollar she had in the world. Eugene looked at the money, looked at her, picked up his pen. She signed where he pointed. She was walking out the door with the deed in her saddlebag when a voice came from the corner chair, not directed at her, not loud, just a man, still reading his newspaper, saying to no one in particular, "Brave woman." She didn't look back. She had noted him the moment she walked in, had noted the newspaper that was folded to the same page it had been on when she arrived 15 minutes earlier, had noted the quality of his coat and the specific style of his boots and the particular way a man sits when he is pretending to be relaxed rather than actually relaxed. She knew exactly what he was. She just didn't have proof yet. The ride up to Harrow Ridge for the first time took 3 hours from town. The land office survey gave her a rough boundary map, but the actual terrain was something else entirely. The lower slopes were heavy pine forest, the kind that closes in around you and makes direction feel uncertain if you let it. Above the tree line were meadows of dry autumn grass and rock outcroppings that made the going technical. And above that, the upper ridge itself, a long, jagged spine of granite, running east to west with views in every direction that, on a clear day, probably reached 50 miles. Wren rode the entire perimeter before she dismounted. 4 hours, slower than the approach, making notes in her own small leather-bound book, marking the spots where the fence would need to go, where the natural geography created choke points and observation positions, where water sources were located, where the ground was soft enough to show tracks, and where it was rocky enough to hide them. This was not how most people would have spent their first afternoon on a new property. Most people would have found the flat ground and started thinking about where to put a structure. But Wren Callard had not raised most people. She was there until the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the temperature fell 10 degrees in 20 minutes the way it does at elevation in Montana in September. She made camp at the base of a granite outcropping on the north face, sheltered from the wind, with a sightline on the most accessible approach from the east, and ate jerky and hardtack and drank water from a canteen, and watched the stars appear one by one until the whole sky was blazing with them. She had not cried since Texas. She did not cry now, but she sat for a long time looking at the mountain that surrounded her and thinking about her father and thinking about her husband and thinking about the particular brand of loneliness that comes not from being alone but from being alone in the presence of things you love that can no longer love you back. Then she rolled up in her blanket and slept 7 hours and got up before dawn and started building the fence. It took 6 weeks. 3 miles of barbed wire is not a casual project for one person. But Wren had planned it the way her father had taught her to plan difficult things, which was to break it into pieces small enough to complete in a day and then do that. One day, one section, then the next. She hired the post hole digging done in 3 sections, because even Wren Callard had a practical relationship with her own limitations. Digging 3 miles of post holes in Montana granite in the fall was not something one person could reasonably accomplish in a useful time frame. She paid the 2 young men from town who did it in cash and asked no questions and answered fewer. They were grateful for the work and bewildered by the woman, and wise enough not to let the bewilderment show. The stringing she did herself. Barbed wire is not forgiving. It bites. It tangles. It catches on itself and on your clothes and on your skin with equal indifference. By the end of 6 weeks, her hands were marked with 100 small cuts in various stages of healing. She wore leather gloves when she remembered to and paid the price when she forgot. The signs went up last. She carved them herself from pine boards. Each letter deliberate: private land, no hunting, no trespassing. W. Callard. She stood back and looked at the first sign after she'd nailed it to the post. There, she said. To no one. To the mountain, maybe. To herself. Soot stood behind her and breathed warm air against her neck, which was as close to moral support as Wren had experienced in the last 2 years. Thank you, she told the horse. She meant it. The cabin took 3 more weeks. She'd chosen the site on her first day, a natural shelf on the south-facing slope at about 4,000 feet elevation. Protected from north wind, morning sun, a clean spring 10 yards to the east that ran year-round, according to the survey notes and according to the evidence of green growth around it, even in the late-season dryness. She had built things before. Not a cabin exactly, but structures. Her father had believed in knowing how to make shelter from materials at hand, and there were years in her childhood when she and Harlan had spent more time in field camps than in towns. And she had learned by watching and then by doing. The walls were pine logs from the deadfalls, Already on the property, she didn't cut living trees, partly out of preference, and partly because the dead wood was already seasoned and easier to work. The roof was a combination of split timber and pine bark, laid in overlapping layers that would shed water and retain heat. The door she built from planks she bought from the lumberyard in Ridgeback Creek and hauled up on Soot in 3 trips. It was small, 1 room, a fireplace in the north wall, built from the granite that was everywhere on the property. 2 windows, shuttered, positioned to let in the morning light, without exposing the interior to the eastern approach. That last part was not accidental. Neither was the fact that the cabin's position meant you couldn't see it from below until you were already within 100 yards of it. These were things she thought about, things she had always thought about. When she finally lit the first fire in the new fireplace on a cold October evening and sat on the floor because she hadn't built furniture yet and looked at the small orange light playing on the log walls, she allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite pride, and not quite relief, and not quite grief, but some compound of all 3 that didn't have a clean name. She was here. The mountain was hers. And somewhere under this mountain, if her father's notes were right, was the reason 2 men she had loved were dead. She had found the notebook 3 weeks after she arrived. She had been looking for it, because she had known it was there, or suspected strongly enough that it was the primary reason she'd paid every dollar she had for this particular piece of Montana real estate, and not a different one. Her father had been a methodical man, not a complicated man. Wren Callard had never had much patience for complexity, but methodical in the way of someone who understands that information is only as valuable as its survival. A notebook that could be taken from your body was not safe. A notebook hidden in a location only you knew about was better. A notebook hidden in a location only you knew about, but whose existence you'd hinted at, in indirect terms, to the one person you trusted most. In a letter she'd only received after you were already dead, that was the safest of all. The letter had reached her 6 months after Harlan died. It had been in the care of a lawyer in Laredo who had instructions to hold it for 6 months before forwarding. By the time Wren received it, she had been through the funeral and the inquest, and 2 months of grief that she had handled alone, and mostly successfully, and it was late spring in Texas, and she was reading a dead man's handwriting in a kitchen that still smelled like him. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first was about her, told her things she already knew, that he was proud of her, that she was the best thing he'd managed in a long life of mixed results, that he hoped she found someone worth trusting completely because she'd been too careful about that, and she deserved to not be so alone. The second paragraph was about Boyd, about her husband, said Harlan trusted him and was glad she'd married him, and that Boyd was the kind of man who would always do the right thing even when it cost him, which was either the best thing or the most dangerous thing a person could be, depending on the circumstances. The third paragraph was the one she'd read 17 times. It said, "If anything should happen to me before I get back to you, there is a place I found in Montana, north of a town called Ridgeback Creek, on a high ridge the locals call Harrow Ridge. I left something there in the rocks near the northern peak. It'll make sense when you find it. Don't go looking until you're ready to use what you find. And Wren, be careful. There are people in this who have long memories and no conscience. You know who you are. You know what you can do. Don't let them make you forget either one." She had folded the letter, put it in the inside pocket of her coat, gone back to her work, and spent the next 2 years getting ready. She found the notebook on a Thursday morning in late September. The northern peak of Harrow Ridge was not, technically, a peak in any dramatic sense. It was the highest point of the upper ridge, a granite dome, about 30 feet above the main ridgeline, accessible by a scramble up a crack in the rock face that required both hands and good footwork, but wasn't technically dangerous if you paid attention. The view from the top was extraordinary. The entire range spread out in every direction. She could see Ridgeback Creek to the south, just a smudge of smoke and roofline. The Yellowstone River to the east, a silver thread catching the morning light. She sat up there for 10 minutes before she started looking, not because she needed to think, because she wanted to remember what it felt like before she knew what was in the notebook, because once you open certain doors you don't get to close them again, and she was old enough to understand that, and young enough to sometimes wish she wasn't. The hawk was in the third crevice she checked, a natural crack in the granite at about knee-height on the western face, protected from above by an overhang that had kept it dry for 6 years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job admirably, a small leather-bound notebook, 4 inches by 6, the kind that any general store in the West would sell you for a nickel. She held it for a moment without opening it, thought, "Pa," then opened it. Wren Callard's handwriting was not elegant. He wrote the way he spoke directly, without wasted motion. Short sentences, specific details, dates and compass bearings and distances, paced out in his long stride that he'd once told her was exactly 30 inches, which meant 60 of his steps was 50 feet and 100 was 83, and you could navigate a canyon in the dark, if you needed to, once you'd trained your body to measure its own motion. The first 40 pages were field notes, survey work, topographic observations, notes on timber quality and water sources and soil conditions that the railroad company had been paying him to document. Precise, professional, the kind of notes that told you Wren Callard had been very good at his job. Page 41 was different. It started mid-sentence, like he'd been writing, and then stopped, and then come back and kept going without finding the thread again. The formation on the North Canyon wall. Second entrance, approximately 30 feet up. Quartz vein 2 to 3 inches wide, oriented NNE to SSW. Color and character consistent with the silver bear ink formations at Tonopah and at the Lincoln County finds. Chipped 3 samples. Weight and density match. This is real. Then, estimated extent unknown. Could be a pocket, could be a major deposit running deep into the mountain. Would need a proper geologist to say for certain. But if I had to bet, and I have bet on less, this is the real thing. Then, after a gap of a few lines as if he'd stopped and thought, told AB about it tonight. Probably shouldn't have. But I've known him since New Mexico and he's always been straight with me. If this turns into something, going to need capital I don't have, he might. AB, Aldous Brent. Wren sat on the cold granite and read those 2 letters 3 times. Then she kept reading. The next 20 pages were over the course of the following several months, she could tell from the dates he'd put at the top of each entry. Notes on the territory, observations on the legal situation of the land, references to conversations she couldn't fully reconstruct from one side. And then, starting in early 1878, a tone that changed. AB is moving faster on this than we agreed. He's had someone in the land office in Helena, not Eugene. The other one looking into the title situation on Harrow Ridge. Didn't tell me he was doing that. Found out from the railroad man who works with that office. 2 weeks later, found out he's been talking to Jed Crow. Anyone in the territory who knows that name knows what it means. Crow doesn't do business. He does problems. 1 week after that, I think I made a mistake telling Aldous Brent about this mountain. And then, near the end of what was written, in handwriting that was tighter and faster than the careful entries before it, if something happens to me, before I get this sorted out, Wren will find this. She'll know what to do with it. She always knows what to do. I just hope I've bought her enough time. The last 3 pages were torn out. Clean tears at the binding. Not damage, not deterioration. Someone had removed them deliberately. Wren ran her thumb along the raw edges where the pages had been. Thought about what those pages might have contained. Thought about who had found this notebook between when Harlan hid it and when she had. Thought about the fact that there was someone in this story who had been on this mountain before her, after her father, and had taken what they needed and left the rest. She closed the notebook, put it in the inside pocket of her coat where her father's letter lived, sat for another few minutes on the granite, looking out at the endless unfolded landscape of Montana Territory in the fall. "All right, Pa," she said, very quietly. "I'm here." She went back to the cabin, made coffee, sat at the small table she'd built the previous week and spread out her own notes alongside what her father had written. Started to build a picture. The kind of picture that had too many missing pieces to be certain, but enough that the shape of it was becoming visible. Her father had found something valuable on this mountain. He had made the mistake of telling Aldous Brent. By 1878, he was dead. The official story, Wren Callard had been riding back from a surveying job in the northern ranges of Montana Territory when his horse threw him on a rocky slope. Death from injury sustained in the fall. There was a witness, a rancher, who reported finding the body and an inquest, and a verdict of accidental death. She had never believed it, not because she was suspicious by nature, because she had watched her father work for 18 years, had watched him on terrain far more difficult than a Montana hillside on a well-traveled trail, had watched him on horses that were not well trained, and horses that were spooked, and horses that had done their level best to unseat him. She had never once seen him fail to ride something out. Wren Callard did not get thrown by horses, but she hadn't had anything but her own disbelief. Not then. Not for years until Boyd Callard. She had not expected him. That was the truest thing she could say about her husband. She had not expected him, had not been looking for him, had been, if she was being honest with herself, operating on the private assumption that the shape of her life was probably the shape it would always be moving through, competent, making things work, but essentially solitary in some fundamental way that she'd made her peace with. Boyd had walked into Mrs. Patterson's boarding house in Tucson in the spring of 1880 with mud on his boots and a surveyor's transit over one shoulder and a polite argument with the landlady already in progress about the state of the boots before he'd even put down the transit. And Wren had been sitting in the corner of the dining room, eating her supper and watching the whole thing, and something had shifted, very slightly, like a door that has been set correctly in its frame for the first time. He was not what you'd call dramatically handsome, medium height, brown hair that needed cutting in a way it perpetually received, glasses with round wire frames that he had a habit of pushing up with one finger when he was thinking hard about something. Hands that were always inky at the fingertips from his notebooks and his drafting work. But he listened. That was the thing. He listened to people, as if what they said actually mattered to him, which was a rarer quality than it sounds, and he did it, with a kind of full attention that made you feel, when he was listening to you, like you were the only person in the room. He listened to Wren. She had not realized until someone did it, how long it had been since anyone had. They were married 6 months later. Not impulsive, she had never been impulsive, and she didn't start being impulsive for him. But certain, there was a difference. Impulsive is when you haven't thought about it. Certain is when you've thought about it, and the thinking keeps arriving at the same place. He was good. He was genuinely, uncomplicatedly good, in a way that she had been skeptical was possible in human beings of his age and his experience. He told the truth. He did what he said he would do. He treated people, all people, not just the useful ones, with the basic respect of someone who understood that dignity was not a limited resource. She loved him for all of that. She also loved him for the fact that he never once, in 2 years of marriage, suggested she put away the Colt. In the fall of 1881, Boyd found the letter, her father's letter, the one with the reference to Harrow Ridge. She had kept it, as she kept everything important, in the inside pocket of her everyday coat, which meant it lived in the coat, rather than in any drawer or case, which meant it was accessible but private. She did not know exactly when he found it. What she knew was that one morning in October she woke up and he was already at the table with a cup of coffee and a look on his face that she had not seen before, a carefully composed look that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. "Boyd, good morning. What is it?" A pause. "Then I found something in your coat pocket. I wasn't snooping. I was mending the lining. The pocket has a small tear and I was going to fix it before you noticed and..." He stopped. "I read it. I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry, but I did." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Your father," he said. "Harrow Ridge. You never mentioned. No, were you going to?" She thought about that honestly. Eventually, Wren. He took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, put them back on. If what he describes is accurate, if there's a silver deposit up there, and if there's someone who killed him to keep it quiet, there is. The certainty in her voice stopped him cold. "You know? I suspect. Strongly. That's not the same thing, not yet." He sat with that for a moment, turned the coffee cup in his hands. She waited, because Boyd always came to his conclusions eventually, and interrupting the process never helped. "I want to help," he said finally. "Boyd, I'm a surveyor. I work with land records, property claims, legal instruments. If there's a way to establish your father's prior claim on that property, or to build a legal case for what happened to him, he paused. "That's what I do. Let me help." She had looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Not yet, not until I know more, when it's time." He had agreed. He had in the end not waited. She understood now why he hadn't. Boyd had found something she didn't know what, had never had the chance to ask him, that made him feel the time was closer than she thought. He had acted on it without telling her because he had not wanted to worry her before he knew whether it would amount to anything. He had gone to Butte in December 1881 to meet with someone, a former railroad surveyor who apparently knew something about the 1877 surveys in the northern ranges. He had never told her who the man was or what he hoped to learn. He had left on a Monday. On a Thursday, she had received a telegram from a company foreman at a construction site in Butte. There had been an accident. Boyd had fallen from a scaffold. He had not survived. She had gone to Butte. She had seen where it happened, had talked to the foreman, the workers, the company superintendent, had asked questions in the specific methodical way she had been taught to ask questions when you wanted real answers rather than comfortable ones. Nobody had seen it happen, which was strange. The site had 60 men working on it. The scaffold where Boyd was found was in clear sight of the main work area. Somehow nobody had seen it happen. She had asked about visitors to the site that week, had been told that visitors weren't usually logged, had asked if anyone remembered anything unusual, had been met with varying degrees of blank helpfulness that she could not determine was genuine or performed. She had stayed in Butte for 2 weeks. She had found one thing, a hotel register. 3 blocks from the construction site, a guest had checked in on the Monday Boyd arrived in Butte and checked out the Friday after he died, signed in under the name J. Crawford. But the hotel keeper, a meticulous old German named Kettler, who kept his books with obsessive precision, had noted in his own margin annotation. He did this for everyone, a private system for tracking guests, 2 words next to the J. Crawford entry, big scar, right cheek, long scar running jaw to ear. She had no name to attach to that description. Not then. She would learn eventually that a man named Jed Crow had a scar exactly like that on his right cheek, and that Jed Crow worked for Aldous Brent. But that was later. What she had done, after Butte, was go home. She had packed what mattered, sold what didn't, written to the lawyer in Laredo who'd been holding her father's letter, started looking at maps, started getting ready. 2 years of getting ready. Learning what she needed to learn, finding what she needed to find, building the particular kind of resolve that is not the same as anger. Anger burns quick and uncontrolled and makes you stupid, but is steadier and colder and considerably more useful. She had not told anyone where she was going. She had not told anyone why. She had ridden north. The first poachers came 4 weeks after she finished the fence. She dealt with them as described. 3 shots in the dark from 3 angles. Rifles and mule left behind. 4 hours of walking in the cold to think about their choices. She did not feel particularly triumphant about it. She felt, mostly, like someone who had done a necessary job competently and could now move on to the next necessary job, which was the cabin's second window shutter, which needed new hinges, which she had forgotten to pick up from the hardware store on her last trip to town. This was the reality of living on a mountain alone. The large dramatic events were real, but they were surrounded, always, by an ocean of small practical problems that required immediate attention, regardless of what else was happening. The shutter needed hinges. The hinges required a trip to town. The trip to town required half a day. The half day had to come from somewhere in the work week. She was making the mental schedule for the town trip 3 mornings later when Soot's ears went flat. The horse was tied at the lean-to she'd built on the south side of the cabin, and Soot's ears did not go flat for small things, for birds landing nearby, or the wind shifting direction. Soot's ears went flat for people. Wren picked up the Winchester from the wall beside the door. She did not open the door. She went to the north window, shuttered, but with a 2-inch gap between the shutter and the sill, and looked out. Nothing visible in the immediate vicinity. She stood still for 3 minutes. Then a smell. Wood smoke. Not her smoke, her fire was cold. She hadn't started it yet this morning. This was coming from uphill. From the north face she put on her coat, went outside, followed the smell. The cabin had been there long enough that it had begun to disappear into the mountain. It was built into the base of a granite outcropping on the northern slope, maybe 1.5 miles from her own position, in a hollow that the topography had designed to hide. The logs had weathered to the same gray-brown as the surrounding rocks. The roof was buried under a season's worth of pine needles. If you weren't looking for it, you could ride within 200 feet and not see it. Someone had clearly been counting on that. Smoke came from a chimney that was barely a chimney, a clay-lined hole in the granite at the back of the structure, not even tall enough to draw cleanly, which was why the smell had leaked out rather than rising clear above the tree line. She stopped 30 yards out, studied the situation. Door was shut, one window covered, horses none visible, though there was a lean-to around the back. No sound except the fire and the wind and, now that she was listening, the very faint scrape of something moving inside. Someone was living up here, on her mountain, on 4,200 acres of private land that she had bought and fenced and posted, and someone had been living up here, possibly for some time, possibly before she bought it. She walked up to the door, knocked on it with the butt of the Winchester. 3 sharp raps, silence, then from inside, a voice, rough as gravel, unhurried. Door's not locked. She opened it. He was sitting at a small table by the window, old, genuinely old, not just weathered. She could see it in the way his hands sat on the table and the angle of his spine. 60, maybe 65, maybe more. Hard to tell with men who'd spent their lives outdoors, because the outside did things to a face that made chronology unreliable. White hair, a thick white beard that had gone beyond intentional at some point and become simply a feature. Blue eyes that were so sharp and clear they looked wrong in a face that old, like someone had put young man's eyes in an old man's face by mistake. He was looking at her steadily, not with alarm, not with surprise, with the specific expression of someone who has been expecting a thing and is now watching the thing arrive on schedule. She kept the Winchester at a careful angle, not aimed at him, but not pointing away either. "You're on my land," she said. "I am," he agreed pleasantly. "Who are you?" He looked at her for a moment, and she saw the exact moment when his expression shifted, not into surprise, into something that was recognition and sorrow in roughly equal parts, though it arrived wearing neither of those faces exactly. "You've got his eyes," he said. She went very still. Harlan always said his girl had his eyes. He was right. A pause. "I've been waiting for you, Wren. I'd have come to find you myself, but I wasn't sure you were ready. And then the fence went up and I figured she's getting ready now. Just a matter of time." Her grip on the Winchester had not changed, but something in her chest had. "You knew my father?" "Yes." "How?" "I was the marshal investigating his death." He said it simply, matter-of-factly, no ceremony around it, just the truth laid down on the table between them. "My name is Declan Vore. I was U.S. Deputy Marshal for this district from 1872 to 1879. I found out enough about what happened to your father that certain people decided I should no longer be a marshal. And then I found out enough that those same people decided I should no longer be alive." Another pause. "I've been on this mountain for 18 months. I came here because it was the one place I figured Aldous Brent wouldn't look. His man has been up here twice in the last 6 months. Missed the cabin both times." He said all of this in the same unhurried tone, like a man reporting weather. "You've been hiding here 18 months, she said. "Yes, alone. Mostly." She stared at him. He stared back. Then, very carefully, she lowered the Winchester until the barrel pointed at the floor. "Why did you wait?" she asked. "If you've known I was here." "I wanted to see if you were ready," he said again. "Not ready to be on the mountain. Ready for what being on the mountain means. Ready for what comes next." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Now I've watched you put up 3 miles of fence alone and drive 3 poachers off in the dark without a single soul getting hurt, and I believe you are." A breath, the faintest possible smile at the corner of his weathered mouth. "So, sit down, Wren Callard. There's a great deal I need to tell you." She pulled out the other chair, sat. Outside, the wind moved through the high pines, and the mountain kept its silence, and somewhere far below, in the thin morning light, Ridgeback Creek was waking up and going about its business without any idea of what was sitting up on Harrow Ridge between those two people and that cold fire. What was sitting there was the beginning of the end of Aldous Brent's long run, of getting away with it, though nobody knew that yet. Not for certain, not even Wren, but she was starting to believe it, and for now, on this particular mountain, on this particular morning, that was enough. The fire between them was small. just enough to take the edge off the cold that came through the gaps in the old cabin walls, just enough to see by. Declan had made coffee at some point, real coffee, not the burnt chicory stuff that passed for it in most of Montana territory, and the smell of it filled the small space with something that felt almost domestic, almost ordinary. Nothing about this situation was ordinary. Wren sat across the table from a man she had never met, who claimed to have known her father, who claimed to have investigated her father's death, who had been living on her mountain for 18 months, without her knowledge, waiting for her to arrive. She should have had more questions about that last part. She did have more questions, she just wanted the other answers first. Start at the beginning, she said. Declan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, old hands, scarred across the knuckles in the specific way of someone who had spent years using them for things they weren't designed for. He looked at the fire for a moment like he was deciding something. Then he started talking. The beginning, as it turned out, was 1877, not a beginning Wren had known about. Not the version of her father's life she'd been living alongside as a young woman in Texas, where Wren Callard came home between jobs and sat at the kitchen table and smelled like dust and horse, and told her nothing specific about where he'd been or what he'd done. The version where the work was just work and the man was just her father, and the world was contained and navigable. The real beginning was the summer Harlan rode north for the railroad survey and found the mountain. Declan had not been there for that part. He'd heard it later, pieced together from multiple sources over the years following, assembled slowly the way you assemble things, when the people who know the whole story keep dying before they can tell you all of it. What he did know firsthand started in early 1878. He was deputy marshal for the Central Montana District at the time, appointed under the federal marshal's office out of Helena. His jurisdiction covered a sprawling territory of mountains and river valleys and small towns that were mostly still figuring out whether they were going to survive long enough to become something permanent. It was not glamorous work. It was long rides and cold camps, and the constant low-grade frustration of trying to enforce laws in places where the people making the trouble often had more resources than the people tasked with stopping it. He had known Harlan casually. The way men who move through the same territory come to know each other, not close, but with the mutual recognition of two people who have assessed each other and found the other one trustworthy enough to nod at across a room. He had heard the name Texas Ranger, had seen the man work. That was enough. In March of 1878, Harlan had come to Declan's office in the small town of Kellyton, long gone now, swallowed by a spring flood in 1886, with a request that was not an official matter and was careful to present itself as such. He sat where you're sitting, Declan said, or close to it. Different chair, different office, same idea, a pause. He said he wanted to talk to someone with a badge who wasn't connected to the territorial council. Someone he could trust wasn't in anyone's pocket. I was apparently that someone. He had told Declan about the silver, about the notebook, about his mistake in telling Aldous Brent, about the subsequent weeks in which Brent's behavior had shifted in ways subtle enough to be deniable, but clear enough to someone paying close attention. He had told Declan that Brent had connections to a man named Jed Crow, and he had said, in the particular careful way of a man who wants to communicate danger without triggering it, I need someone to know this exists, in case something happens before I can act on it officially. Did you think something was going to happen? Wren asked. I thought he was being cautious, Declan said. He was always cautious. I didn't take it as a specific warning. I should have. 2 months later, May 1878. Wren Callard was found dead on a slope 8 miles north of Ridgeback Creek by a rancher named Duluth Fay who ran cattle on the lower pastures of the ridge. Single bullet wound to the back of the head. His horse was found 2 miles south, reins trailing, spooked. The official finding: Harlan had surprised an animal bear, probably, or a spooked elk. The horse had thrown him onto the rocky slope, and the fall had been fatal. There was no bear, Wren said flatly. No, Declan said. There was no bear. The wound angle was wrong for a fall. The horse showed no signs of having bolted violently. The saddle was still properly cinched, no broken tack, no torn reins. And there was a mark on the trail itself, found by Declan 3 days after the official inquest had closed the case, that he had gone back specifically to look for. A second set of hoofprints, coming from the east, stopping at the point where Harlan's tracks ended, staying for long enough to leave a standing impression in the soft earth beside the trail, and then leaving north. I took it to the sheriff, Declan said. She waited. The sheriff at the time was a man named Cord Whiting. He listened to everything I had to say, and then he told me that the inquest had already reached a verdict, and that reopening it would require substantial new evidence, and that a set of hoofprints in a public trail was not substantial evidence, because anyone could have been on that trail. And the Territorial Council? Wren asked. Declan looked at her steadily. Aldous Brent had been appointed to the Territorial Council 3 months earlier, he said. In February, right around the time your father came to see me. The timing of that sat in the room between them for a moment. So Brent had been building his position at the same time he was learning what Harlan knew, constructing a legal and political roof over himself, getting high enough that the law would have to reach past him to touch him. Smart, deliberate, cold. So what did you do? Wren asked. I kept digging, Declan said. Quietly, on my own time, for a year of quiet digging, while officially closing the case per the sheriff's instructions, while continuing his regular duties, while building slowly, from fragments a picture of what Aldous Brent had been doing since 1877, and what it had cost at least one man to get in his way. In the spring of 1879, he had found something, not proof, not the kind that would survive a hostile courtroom with Brent's lawyers on the other side, but documentation. A land claim filed by a Brent subsidiary company, one of 6 or 7 shell operations he had apparently constructed over the years to obscure the origin of various business dealings, attempting to establish mining rights to the northern section of Harrow Ridge, filed quietly with a federal surveyor's office in a different district from where the land was actually located. A filing that was technically improper under the terms of the General Mining Law of 1872. Which required a discoverer to be physically present at the location to stake a claim. It wasn't a crime, exactly. It was maneuvering. Legal maneuvering through paperwork, the kind that required lawyers and time and patience to unravel. But it was the first tangible thread connecting Brent to Harrow Ridge on paper. Declan had started writing it all down. A separate record, kept in a separate location from any official file. Names, dates, document references, the shape of what had happened and what was still happening. Then in August of 1879 he had received a visit, not Brent himself. A man he didn't know who arrived at his office one afternoon and sat down without being invited and explained, in the pleasant, measured tone of someone delivering a business proposal, that certain parties in the Territorial Council had become aware of Deputy Marshal Vorey's interest in the Callard matter and found it concerning, and hoped that he might be persuaded to redirect his professional energies elsewhere. How much? Declan said. The man named a number. Declan told him where to put the number. The man had nodded, as if this was the answer he'd expected, and left. 3 weeks later, Declan had been removed from his position. Not fired, the mechanism was more elegant than that. A review of his record. Questions about the handling of several previous cases. An administrative process that concluded with his reassignment to a desk position in Helena that was in practice a slow walk to the door. He resigned rather than take the desk. 2 months after that, his house had burned down. He had not been inside it. He had been, by chance, staying overnight at a colleague's home 8 miles away. He had returned in the morning to find ash. The chair in the corner, he said. The one I always sat in. That was all that was left. Just the frame. Everything else gone. He had looked at that chair frame for a long time. Then he had packed what he still had, which wasn't much, saddled his horse, and started riding. Why here? Wren asked. Of all the places in the territory. Because this is where it started, he said simply. And because I believed eventually that someone would come looking for the truth. I just didn't know who. Didn't know if Harlan had anyone who would come. He looked at her. Your mother had passed. I knew that, but I didn't know about you. Didn't know if he'd told you anything. Didn't know if you had that he stopped. Chose the next word carefully. The disposition to use it. And now, very quietly, now I know. The coffee went cold while he talked. Neither of them noticed. Outside the cabin, the wind had picked up, moving through the high timber with a sound like rushing water. The morning had advanced to midday without Wren registering the passage of time. She had a habit of falling so completely into a line of thinking that the world's ordinary schedule continued without her cooperation. Her father had called it a gift. Her father had also, at various points, called it an inconvenience. She thought about the notebook, the last 3 pages torn out. Someone else was here, she said. Before me. After Pa died, someone found the notebook and took the last pages. Declan nodded. Not surprised, Brent's man. I saw him. Couldn't stop him without giving away my position. Crow? No, Crow doesn't do field work like that. Crow is, he paused. Crow is a specific kind of specialist. He doesn't go climbing rocks looking for notebooks. He has people for the climbing. He saves himself for the part that requires his particular skill. The part that required his particular skill. She knew what that meant. What was on those pages? I don't know exactly, Declan said. What I know is what your father told me in Kellerton. He had written down the name of the railroad surveyor who had been with him when he found the silver, the man who could corroborate the find independently, a man named Reuben Sachs. And Sachs died in a mining accident in Colorado, Declan said. October 1878, 5 months after your father. She sat very still. That is not a coincidence, she said. No, so both witnesses to the original find are dead. Yes, and the pages that identified Sachs are gone. Yes, which means Brent has covered every original witness, every document that could place him at the start of this. What's left is circumstantial. He leaned forward slightly. Except for what I have. She looked at him. He got up from the table, went to the back wall of the cabin, pulled aside a section of the log wall that turned out, on inspection, designed to be pulled aside, a concealed panel fitted so carefully into the surrounding timber that you'd never find it without knowing it was there. Behind it, a hollow in the granite of the outcropping that the cabin was built against. Inside the hollow, a tin box, sealed with a clasp, wrapped in oilcloth. He brought it to the table and set it down. 18 months of having nothing else to do, he said. You organize things. She opened the box. The contents were meticulous. Declan was, as it turned out, a man whose natural inclination toward order had been sharpened rather than broken by years of adversity. The documents inside the tin box were arranged in chronological sequence, each one wrapped in its own smaller piece of oilcloth and labeled in the neat handwriting of a man who had learned that details matter and had never unlearned it. Land filing records, the Brent subsidiary claim, and 3 others, each one in a different company name, each one filed through a different office, each one representing a piece of what appeared to be a deliberate legal strategy to establish mining rights to Harrow Ridge through paperwork rather than presence. Witness statements. Not from the Callard inquest, those records had been officially closed and Declan had not been permitted access, but from 3 separate individuals who had observed at various points over the 5 years following Harlan's death, Aldous Brent or his representatives traveling to and from the Harrow Ridge area. All 3 statements were sworn. All 3 signatories were still living, so far as Declan knew. All 3 were located outside Montana territory. A record of Jed Crow's movements. Not comprehensive. Crow was careful, and Declan had been compiling this from fragments over years, but covering 12 specific dates between 1878 and 1882, each with notation of where Crow had been documented to be and what had occurred in proximity to his presence. The last entry on the list was December 1881. Butte, Montana. Wren read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the fire. She had known. She had known in her bones since the telegram arrived, since she had gone to Butte and walked the construction site and asked questions she never got real answers to. She had known the way you can know things before the evidence exists to justify the knowing, not because you're guessing, but because you have been paying attention long enough that the pattern declares itself before the proof arrives. Knowing and reading it in someone else's handwriting. Different things. He went after Boyd, she said. Not a question. Yes, Declan said. Why? Boyd wasn't. He didn't know about Harrow Ridge until he read your father's letter and started asking questions. Declan's voice was careful, even. He was delivering something fragile. Boyd wrote a letter to a law office in Helena in November of 1881, apparently requesting information about the legal status of Harrow Ridge and the possibility of contesting a mining claim. The law office, I don't know which one. I only know this happened. The law office had a connection to Brent's business interests. The letter was flagged. She closed her eyes, just for a second. Boyd, writing a letter, trying to help, trying to do the right thing. She had told him to wait. He had not waited, and she could not, in her most honest self, fault him for it, because he had been trying to help her, because Boyd Callard had been constitutionally incapable of knowing that someone had been wronged and not doing something about it. It had been his greatest quality. It had also killed him. "Why didn't you contact me?" she asked. Quiet, controlled after Boyd. "You knew who I was. You knew what had happened. Why didn't you?" "I thought about it." A pause. "I decided against it." "Why?" "Because I didn't know if I could keep you safe. And I didn't know if what I had was enough. And I didn't know." He stopped, started again. "Your father trusted me with information, and he died. Your husband found that information on his own, and he died. I wasn't prepared to contact Wren Callard's daughter and hand her a target to put on her own back without something closer to a complete case." He looked at his hands. "So I came here, and I built what I could build from here, and I waited." Wren was quiet for a long time. The wind outside, the small fire, the tin box on the table between them with its careful, meticulous documentation of years of things going wrong. "Is it enough?" she finally asked. "What you have," Declan considered. "It's enough to take to a federal marshal," he said. "Not the territorial system. Brent has too much purchase there. A federal marshal bypassing the territorial structure entirely. What I have, combined with your father's notebook and what happened to Boyd, yes, I believe it's enough." She looked at the documents spread on the table. Then she looked up at him. "Or?" she said, because she could hear the or in the silence that followed his answer. "Or," Declan said, "we wait for Brent to come to us." She stayed in Declan's cabin until the light started going. Then she went back to her own. The walk took 40 minutes through the timber, following a route she'd already memorized well enough to manage in the dark if she had to, which she had already had to, twice, which is how she'd memorized it. She did not make a decision that evening. She made supper beans and salt pork, which was not interesting, but was warm and sufficient, and she ate it standing up, which was a habit she'd had since she was 14, and her father had pointed out that you could eat standing up in the same time it took to eat sitting down and be ready to move the moment you were done. She cleaned the dishes. She checked the Winchester. She checked the Colt. She sat at her own table with her father's notebook and the copy she had made of its contents in her own hand, done the week after she found it, because having one copy of something important was exactly as smart as having none, and she read through it again. Not because the information had changed, because she needed to think, and reading was how she thought. Outside, the night came in fast the way it does in October at elevation. One moment there was enough light to see by, and then there wasn't. The stars arrived in quantity. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour. She built up the fire and sat with it. Thought about her father, thought about Boyd. Thought about a man named Aldous Brent, who had been making decisions about other people's lives for years now, from behind a wall of money and lawyers and political position, and the comfortable assumption that there was no one left with the standing or the inclination to come after him properly. He thought the notebook pages he'd taken were the dangerous ones. He thought the railroad surveyor's death had covered the only corroboration. He thought that Declan Vore was dead, or gone, or irrelevant. He had been operating, for years, in the specific kind of confidence that comes from having eliminated every threat you're aware of. He was not aware of all the threats. That was the problem with being Aldous Brent. You got good at removing the things you could see, and then you stopped looking for the things you couldn't. She went to town the next morning. Ridgeback Creek in November was a different creature from Ridgeback Creek in September. The main street was half empty on weekday mornings, the fair-weather population having drifted south before the passes closed. The mud that had been a constant feature of the fall had frozen into ruts and ridges that made walking a negotiation. The sky was the particular shade of pale gray that in Montana means snow is thinking about it. She needed hinges. She also needed to look at Aldous Brent, not to confront him, not yet, just to see him in the context of his own town, his own position, the structure of local deference he had built around himself, to assess it, to understand its specific dimensions. She got the hinges from the hardware store, made conversation with the owner, a heavy-set man named Ira, who had the quality of cheerful disinterest that made him excellent at his job. He could talk about hinge gauges and weather for 20 minutes without registering anything personal about the person he was talking to, which meant people trusted him with information because he seemed to immediately forget it. She walked past the bank on the way back to her horse. The bank was the largest building on the main street. 2 stories, brick facade unusual for Ridgeback Creek, which ran mostly to board and batten with lettering above the door that read Ridgeback Territorial Savings and Trust, and below that, in smaller letters, a Brent, chairman. She stood for a moment, looking at the building, then looked left, without moving her head much, which was a technique for observing things, without obviously observing them, that her father had taught her, and that still worked in 1883, the same way it had always worked, because human nature had not meaningfully changed. There was a man across the street, leaning against the post of the dry goods store, hat pulled down, not looking at her directly, but positioned in exactly the place you would position yourself if you wanted to observe someone at the bank without being obvious about it. He was watching her. Wren kept her expression unchanged. She turned and walked back to Soot, mounted up, rode north out of town at a pace that said nothing. Just a woman leaving town after errands, ordinary, unmemorable. At the top of the first hill, where the trail bent behind a stand of pines and the town disappeared from view, she stopped, waited 3 minutes. Nobody followed. She rode on. She told Declan about the watcher that evening. He listened without expression. Then, what did he look like? She described him, medium height, younger mid-30s, a specific quality of stillness that was not natural stillness, practiced. The stillness of someone trained to be less visible than they actually are. Declan was quiet. Could be Crow's man, he said. Crow doesn't operate alone. He has 2 or 3 people he uses for surveillance, information gathering before a pause, before whatever comes next. So Brent knows I'm watching. He knows you're here, Declan said. He's known that since you signed the deed. The question is what he's decided to do about it. The first wave of poachers was reconnaissance, finding out how you'd respond. Whether you were just a woman sitting on a piece of land, or whether you were something more complicated. And now he knows. Now he knows. She thought about that. Good, she said. Declan looked at her. Good? If he thinks I'm a problem, she said, he'll eventually decide to come deal with the problem himself. Men like Brent don't delegate everything. Not when it involves the thing they actually care about. Not when there's been a chain of mistakes. She met Declan's eyes. He'll want to be certain. That's a dangerous assumption to build a plan around. Most useful assumptions are. The second wave of poachers came 12 days later. Not casual trespassers this time. These were different. She knew it from the moment she found their tracks at the eastern boundary 3 days before she saw them. Because the snow that had fallen the previous week was a gift in that regard, showing everything that moved across it in precise and legible detail. 4 horses, shod, which ruled out feral stock, moving in a tight grouping that spoke to either a military background or someone who had given specific instructions about formation. They had crossed the fence not at the eastern post, where the first group had crossed, but 200 yards north of it, at a point where the barbed wire made a slight dip over uneven ground, a weakness in the line that you would not notice unless you had studied the fence from outside the perimeter, which meant they had studied the fence from outside the perimeter. They had been watching before they came in. She found this out at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. She spent the next 6 hours making her own preparations, not running, not riding to town for help, because help took time and time was a resource that someone who'd been watching the fence already had more of than she did. She went to Declan, not to ask him to fight. He would fight. She already knew this. It was written in the set of his shoulders, and in the way he held himself even now, at his age, with his old injuries. But he was 60-something, and his hands shook in the cold, and what she needed from him was not muscle. What she needed was eyes. North face, she said, spreading her copy of the survey map on his table. Here, there's a shelf at about 4,500 feet, with a clear sight line to both the upper meadow and the western canyon approach. I need someone there by 2 this afternoon. He looked at the map. And you? I'll be wherever they go. He nodded. Just once. Like this was a reasonable plan, which it was, and like he was entirely prepared to implement it, which he was. She respected enormously that he did not tell her to be careful. They came in at 3 in the afternoon, not midnight, daylight, which told her something, which told her these 4 men were not trying to avoid detection. They were not afraid of being seen. They were, in fact, possibly hoping to be seen. Because men who hope to be seen are either very confident or very stupid, and these men moved with the specific competence that eliminated stupid as an option. She followed them for 2 hours, not close, 150 yards back, moving parallel through the timber, keeping terrain features between herself and them the way her father had taught her. Put a hill between you and the sound, put trees between you and the sight, put distance between you and the smell of tobacco. They didn't know they were broadcasting. They were searching. Not hunting. There was no hunting behavior, no attention to animal sign, no pauses at likely elk habitat. They were searching for something specific, moving in a systematic east-to-west sweep of the upper meadow zone, occasionally stopping to consult what looked like a hand-drawn sketch of the terrain. A sketch. Someone had given them a terrain sketch of her mountain. Someone who had been up here before. She thought about that, kept moving. At 4:15, they found the spring on the north face, the one near the northern peak, the one near the hawk where her father had hidden the notebook. They gathered around it, and there was a conversation she was too far away to hear. And then one man broke away from the group and started climbing the rocks above the spring, toward the crevice. She did not move faster. Fast was noise. Fast was visibility. Fast was the wrong response. She moved at the same careful pace toward a different approach to the same height. The granite scramble she had done a dozen times now. She was faster at it than she had been the first day, knew the sequence of handholds, knew where the footing was reliable and where it looked reliable but wasn't. She came up on the north face and moved left along the ridgeline. Below her, the man was still climbing. The other 3 were in the meadow, waiting. She was above him before he reached the top. She waited. He pulled himself up onto the dome, breathing hard from the climb, and straightened, and turned to face the northern view. Didn't see her immediately. She was 20 feet to his left, standing between 2 upright rock faces, just a shadow between shadows. Then he turned and saw her. He went very still. She had the Winchester level, not aimed at his chest, aimed at the rock 3 feet to his left. Warning geometry. First conversation geometry. Looking for something? She said. He was in his 30s, dark coat, hat, working man's hands, but something in his posture that was not a working man's posture. He was frightened, hiding it, but frightened. Ma'am, I've found, she said, that this particular rock face is very interesting to a very specific kind of visitor. What kind of visitor are you? A pause. Just hunting. You came up here with a terrain sketch of my property, she said. That's not hunting. That's something else. His eyes cut briefly to the crevice, just for a fraction of a second. But she saw it. The crevice. The specific one, 8 feet to his right. The one where her father's notebook had been. He knew about the crevice. Someone had told him about it. Who sent you? She said. Silence. Below, she could hear the other 3 men beginning to move, beginning to realize their companion had been up too long. I'm going to be direct with you, she said, because I think you're a man who was hired to do a job, not a man who started any of this. And I don't have particular interest in the hired men. I have interest in the man doing the hiring. He was listening. That was something. Tell me who sent you to this specific location, looking for this specific thing. Walk off my mountain, and I will not remember your face. The men below called up, an edge of concern in it now. He looked at the crevice, looked at her, at the Winchester, back at her face. Brent, he said, barely a breath. Brent sent you to find out if the deposit was still there, to get eyes on the location and the sketch. Crow made it. From memory, he was up here. He stopped when? Not a question. Command, I don't know exactly. Before you bought the land, he found the notebook, took some pages. Wren was quiet. Then, go, he went. Fast. Faster than was safe on the descent, but she understood the impulse and did not follow. Below, she heard voices, the sound of horses being gathered, the sound, eventually, of hooves moving away south. She stood on the granite dome alone, looked at the crevice, looked at the view her father had looked at while he wrote in the notebook that had cost him everything. The wind came off the upper peaks and brought the smell of approaching snow. "All right," she said. To no one, to the mountain, to whatever of her father was still up here in some sense that she didn't believe in literally but felt the reality of anyway. "I understand now." She came down off the mountain as the light failed. Not to her cabin, to town. Because what had just happened changed the timeline. Because Brent was not waiting for her to fail on her own. He was actively investigating the property, actively looking for the silver, actively sending men to locate specifically the crevice where her father's notebook had been hidden, which meant he was not consolidating and defending. He was moving towards something, planning his next step, and when Brent's next step came, she intended to be ready. Nate Bridle's office was lit when she arrived. One lamp, in the window, the particular warm yellow of oil light in November dark. She tied Soot at the post and knocked. He opened the door before the knock finished. He had been at his desk, papers spread, the look of a man working late on something that wasn't satisfying him. He looked at her, she looked at him. "You knew my father," she said. It was not a question. She knew he had. She had heard it twice, from two separate people in town, mentioned in the context of the old days, of the territory before it was what it was now. She just hadn't addressed it directly with him yet. "I did," he said. "Then we should talk." He stepped back and let her in. Nate Bridle was 58 years old and had been sheriff of this district for 11 years, which in Montana territory was long enough to have seen the full arc of Aldous Brent's rise. He was a careful man, not a cowardly man careful. There was a distinction. Cowardly men avoided conflict because they feared the cost. Careful men avoided conflict until they had enough certainty of the outcome to justify the engagement. Nate Bridle had spent 11 years maintaining a careful equilibrium between what the law said and what the law could actually accomplish against a man with Brent's resources. He had not liked that equilibrium. He had maintained it anyway, because the alternative, a direct confrontation that failed, would have left the people he was meant to protect with a sheriff who had tried and lost, which was worse than having a sheriff who had not tried. But he had not liked it. He listened to Wren without interruption for 40 minutes. When she was done, he sat quiet for a time. Then, "How good is what Vor has in that tin box?" "Good enough for a federal marshal," Wren said. "Not the territorial system." He nodded slowly. "Brent has the territorial system managed. He doesn't have federal reach, not yet. No, but going to Helena takes time. And in that time, he's already moved," Wren said. "Today, he had 4 men on my property with a terrain sketch of the north face. He's trying to verify the silver deposit before he makes his next move." Bridle was quiet for a moment. "What's his next move, do you think?" "He can't file a legal mining claim while I own the land," she said. "So either he buys the land, which he's going to try, or he finds a way to make me not own it anymore. One way or another." Bridle looked at her steadily. "He'll try to buy it first," he said. "In his mind, everything has a price. He'll come with an offer." "Something will happen," she said. "Yes. Let it," she said. He stared at her. "Let it," she repeated. "But be in a position to see it when it does." There was a pause. Long enough for Nate to think it through. She watched him thinking. Watched the balance being calculated, what he could do, what he was willing to do, what the law permitted versus what he would permit himself. "All right, there's one other thing," she said. "What?" "Your deputy. Holler." Nate's expression didn't change much, but something behind it did. Something careful and controlled that told her this was not entirely a surprise. "What about him?" "He was watching me in town today," she said. "He was watching from the dry goods store when I walked past the bank. I don't think he's doing that on his own time." Very long silence. "How sure are you?" Nate said. "Sure enough to tell you," she said. "Not sure enough to act on it yet. But watch what happens after our conversations. That'll tell you." He said nothing more on that subject, which was, itself, a kind of answer. She was almost back to the mountain when it happened. Dusk. The trail, north out of town, where the timber came close on both sides, and the road narrowed to something not much wider than a horse. She had ridden it a dozen times. She knew every bend. The horse stepped onto the trail from the east side timber at a walk. One rider, dark coat, dark hat, deliberately positioned at the center of the narrow road, so that there was no polite way to pass on either side without one of them yielding. Not polite. That was the point. She stopped. Soot. Assessed. Jed Crow. She had not seen him before. had not had a face to attach to the name until now, but she knew with the specific certainty of someone who has been told what to look for that this was him. The scar on his right cheek, long and old, running from jaw to ear, the pale silver of something that had healed years ago and been there long enough to become just a feature of the face. He was not young, closer to 40 than 30, but there was nothing of 40 about the way he sat the horse, or the way his right hand rested on his thigh, positioned exactly as it would be if the next motion was a draw. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Mrs. Callard," he said. Pleasant, conversational. The voice of a man who was entirely comfortable in the middle of a narrow trail at dusk with his hand near his gun. She said nothing. "Mr. Brent asked me to pass along his regards," Crow said. "And his offer? $600 for the deed to Harrow Ridge. He understands you've put some improvements into it, which he's prepared to account for. All in, he's calling it a fair price for a piece of land that most folks in this county consider a liability." He stopped, waiting for her to respond. She let the silence run out long enough to be uncomfortable. "Then tell Mr. Brent that $600 doesn't cover what that land has already cost me," she said, "and tell him I know what happened on that mountain in June of 1878. Something crossed Crow's face. Not fear. She didn't think fear was in this man's repertoire, at least not in any simple form. It was something subtler, an adjustment, a recalibration. The expression of a man who has just been given information that changes his assessment of a situation. He looked at her with genuine attention for the first time, like he was actually seeing her. "Harlan's girl," he said. She had not told him whose daughter she was. He had known before this conversation. "You knew who I was when you watched me from the dry goods store today," she said. A pause, a slight shift in his weight. "Word of advice," he said, and his tone had changed. Still measured. Still controlled, but something in it that was not kind, exactly, but honest. Like he was stepping out of the professional role for a single sentence. "Leave. Take whatever offer Brent makes and leave. Not because of him. Because this ends badly for everyone if you stay. And you're young enough that badly isn't permanent yet." She looked at him steadily. "You killed my father," she said, "and my husband." No accusation in her voice, no anger. Just the statement of a thing she knew. Crow looked at her for a long moment. "Right away, Mrs. Callard," he said, very quietly. "No," she said, equally quiet. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he moved his horse to the side of the trail. "Let her pass." She rode past him without looking back, because looking back was the thing you did when you were afraid. She was not afraid. She was something else, something that did not have a clean name. Something that was resolve and grief and the specific clarity that comes when you have been moving toward a thing for 2 years and can finally feel it close enough to touch. When she was around the bend and he was behind her, she breathed out slowly. Soot's ears stayed flat for another 1/4 mile. She did not tell Declan about Crow right away. She went home first, made a fire, sat with it, thought about the word he had used. "Leave. You're young enough that badly isn't permanent yet." He was right about that, technically. She was 26. There was a version of this where she took whatever money Brent offered and rode south and built a different life somewhere else. There was a version where 2 dead men stayed buried and a murderer stayed comfortable, and the mountain stayed with all its secrets intact, and Wren Callard disappeared into the general noise of the West and was forgotten by everyone who'd hoped she'd be trouble. She thought about that version, genuinely considered it. Sat with it for 20 minutes by the fire. Then she picked up her father's notebook. Read the last thing he had written before those final torn-out pages. "I think I made a mistake telling Aldous Brent about this mountain. And below that, if something happens to me before I get this sorted out, Wren will find this. She'll know what to do with it. She always knows what to do. I just hope I've bought her enough time." She closed the notebook. He had not bought her enough time. Not in the end, but she had made her own time. The way she had learned to make most things by doing what needed to be done without waiting for someone else to do it first. She told Declan about Crow the next morning. He listened, said nothing for a while. "Then he warned you to leave." "Yes, and you didn't." "No," another silence. "That changes things," Declan said. "When Crow gives someone a warning and they don't take it, there's a sequence that follows. He reports back to Brent. Brent decides what to do with that information. And then he stopped. Something in the way he stopped. Declan. And then he stops trying to buy the land. The implication sat in the room. She understood it. How long, she said. He thought. A week, maybe 2. He'll want to be certain the offer is truly dead before he looked at the fire. He's done this before. The pattern is consistent. He makes a legitimate business offer. When it fails, there's a period of increased pressure. When that fails, he stopped again. Something happens to the person who said no. Wren finished. Yes. She nodded slowly. Good, she said. He looked at her with the same expression as the first time she'd said that word, in the same tone with the same meaning. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true, she said. If he's done trying to buy the land, he has to move. And if he moves, he makes a mistake. Men like Brent don't think of it as a mistake, she said. They think of it as a solution. And solutions make them careless, because solutions always worked before. Declan was quiet for a moment. Your father used to think like that, he said. Not as a compliment or a criticism, just as an observation. The kind that comes out involuntarily when you see one person in another. She didn't answer that. There was nothing to answer. 4 days later, someone tried to take Soot. She heard it before she saw it. Not because the person was loud, they were not, but because Soot had a very specific sound she made when she was unhappy about something close to her. Not a full whinny. A single sharp exhale through the nose, repeated twice. A warning sound that Wren had learned to respond to the way most people respond to a fire alarm. She was up and at the window in 4 seconds. 3 in the morning. No moon tonight, just stars and snow-reflected light, which was enough to see by if your eyes had adjusted, which hers had because she slept with the fire banked low and the darkness real. A man at the lean-to, Soot's rope already in his hands, the horse already skittering sideways and refusing to move in the way that Soot refused things, which was with her full body weight and an expression of obstinate indifference to whatever the human wanted. He was trying to cut the tether. Wren was outside in 6 seconds, Winchester in hand. No boots, she had learned to sleep with her clothes on. He heard her coming, turned, dropped the knife, put his hands up. In the starlight she could see he was young, possibly not 20 yet. Someone's hired hand who had drawn a bad assignment. Don't, she said. He didn't. She marched him inside, made him sit at the table, made coffee, which was a decision she regretted somewhat while she was making it because it suggested a patience she did not feel, but which her father had always done when there was information to be gotten from someone, and she trusted that instinct. The coffee, in the end, was useful. He wrapped his hands around the cup the way cold people do. And then he talked, not about Brent specifically. He didn't know anything about the larger situation. He was a ranch hand from the Brent property south of town, who had been told by the ranch foreman to ride up, take the woman's horse, leave it 3 miles south tied to a post. A message, not a theft, a message. She let him go, stood in the door, and watched him ride south in the dark, then went back inside and sat at the table and thought about escalation. About what it meant that Brent was now sending people to her property in the night. What it meant that it was still messages rather than something else. He was not done being patient. He was almost done, but not quite. She had a little time left. Not much. She went to Declan the next morning with a new understanding of the timeline. They sat at his table with the tin box open between them and went through the documents one more time. Not because anything had changed. Because this was how she thought about plans, by looking at all the pieces together and asking herself what she still didn't have. What she still didn't have was Brent on the property. Everything in the tin box was circumstantial in the hands of a good defense attorney. The sworn statements, the land filings, the record of Crow's movements, all of it built a picture. None of it was a direct connection. None of it was the kind of evidence that survived the scorched earth legal strategy that a man with Brent's money could deploy. What she needed was Brent himself, making the final decision himself, coming to verify himself, being present at the moment the evidence was gathered, so that his presence was itself part of the evidence. He'll come, Declan said, when he's ready. He always comes personally when it's the final stage. You've seen him do this before. Once, Declan said. A homesteader south of here, 1,880. Brent sent his men first, pressured, then threatened, then and then he came himself after, to inspect the property he'd acquired, walked the land, made his own assessment. He paused. He needs to see things with his own eyes. It's his character. He doesn't fully trust anyone else's report. That was a trait, Wren thought. That was a very useful trait in an adversary. When he comes, she said, I want you to go to Helena. Declan looked at her sharply. I want you out of here with the documents, she said. Riding to Helena before Brent arrives, taking everything in that box to the federal marshal's office and filing a formal complaint that establishes all of this on the official record. Because if something goes wrong up here, nothing is going to. Declan. Her voice was even, patient. The voice of someone who has thought this through from multiple angles and is presenting the conclusion. If something goes wrong, the documents are the only thing that survives. If they're here when Brent arrives, they're vulnerable. If they're in a federal office in Helena, they exist regardless of what happens on this mountain. He looked at her for a long moment. And you, he said. I'll have Nate Bridle, she said. He was quiet. And Fen, she said. He looked up. Fen Harker? I'm going to find him. You know where to look? My father taught me who he was and where his people winter, she said. I know the general area. And if he's as good at tracking as Pa always said, he'll know I'm looking before I get there. Declan was quiet for a long moment, looking at the documents, looking at her, looking at something internal that she couldn't see. Your father would be, he started. She shook her head, very slightly, but clearly he stopped. She appreciated again his ability to read the things she didn't say. She found Fen Harker 3 days later, or more accurately, he found her. She had ridden east and slightly south, toward the winter camping area her father had mentioned once in casual conversation. Years ago, the way you mention things you don't think are particularly important at the time, and only later realize you were making a map for someone. 2 days' ride through increasingly difficult terrain, climbing into the eastern foothills where the shelters better and the whitetails were still running. On the second afternoon, she had stopped to water. Soot at a creek crossing, and a voice had come from the timber above. You look like your father on a horse. She had not gone for the colt, because if a man in those rocks had wanted to harm her, he would not have announced himself first. So I've been told, she said. Fen Harker came down the bank and stood in front of her. He was not what she'd expected, which was her own failure of imagination. She had carried some generic image of the word, and found instead a specific person, 44 years old. Built solid and economical, with no wasted physical expression, wearing practical clothes, rather than any particular costume of the time, with a face that was patient in the specific way of someone who has learned that patience, and not much else gets you where you're going in a world that is frequently in a hurry, and frequently wrong about where it's going. He looked at her with the assessing interest of someone genuinely encountering a new thing. Harlan talked about you, he said. He didn't talk much about you, she said. But what he said was enough. What did he say? That you knew the land better than the land knew itself, and that you were the most honest person he'd ever met who could also disappear completely when disappearing was called for. Fen thought about this for a moment. That's about right, he said. She told him what was happening. All of it. The same way she'd told Declan. The same way she'd told Nate Bridle, because partial information was worse than none. And because she needed people who understood the whole situation to function within it effectively. He listened, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then the North Canyon, he said. There's a way through that your surveyors never found. Comes out above the upper meadow. Your father knew it. I showed him once, years ago. Can it be used as... Yes, he said it before she finished. If Brent's men come from the south, I can move behind them through the North Canyon without being seen. Put myself between them and any exit before they know I'm there. She looked at him. You'll help. Not a question. She just wanted to hear what he said. He looked back at her steadily. Your father was a man worth helping, he said, and what happened to him was wrong. So, a pause, simple as a period. Yes, they rode back to Harrow Ridge together. The night before she left to find him, there had been a fire. Not on her property, in town. A small fire contained quickly at the edge of the stable yard where her supplies were stored when she was in town. No animals hurt, no major damage, but a clear reminder that she was not beyond reach. She had ridden past the stable yard on her way out, had looked at the blackened corner of the fence, had considered what it meant, and had filed it under the category of things that made her more certain rather than less. When she returned with Fen and found Declan at her cabin, with a look she had not seen on him before, controlled but not entirely, The way a man looks when he has been frightened and has decided not to stay frightened. She understood that something had happened in the 4 days she was gone. "Tell me," she said. He told her. While she was away, 3 men had come up the mountain. Not poachers this time, not survey. 3 men who moved with the specific economy of Crow's people, who had gone directly and without hesitation to the cabin, which they had searched thoroughly, and then set on fire. The fire. She stood in front of what was left of it as the sun was going down. The walls were partially standing. Log construction doesn't burn the way frame does. And the fire had not been thorough, which suggested they weren't trying to eliminate the structure so much as the contents. The roof was gone. The inside was ash. Everything she owned that was inside was gone. The tin box was not inside. The copy of her father's notebook was not inside. She had taken both with her when she rode east, because she had learned from her father that the thing you cannot afford to lose is the thing you carry. But the cabin was gone. The work of her hands. The fireplace she had built stone by stone. The table and the chair and the small things she had gathered over weeks of living on this mountain. Gone. She stood in front of it until the light failed completely. Declan stood beside her, not speaking. Fen was somewhere in the tree line, doing whatever Fen did when he was thinking. Soot stood behind her with her head at Wren's shoulder, breathing warm breath into the cold air, and in the ash, in the place where the hearth had been, something caught the last of the fading light. Something small, metal, unburnable. She walked into the ruin, picked it up. It was her father's Texas Ranger badge. She had not put it in the cabin. She had carried it always in the pocket of her coat, which meant someone had taken it from her coat pocket, which meant someone had been close enough to her to take something from her coat without her knowing. She turned the badge over in her fingers. The heat from the fire had not touched it. It was exactly as it had always been. And then she understood what this was. This was not vandalism. This was not even threat. This was Aldous Brent telling her, with the specific cruelty of a man who wanted her to know exactly how far his reach extended. "I was here before you. I was here when your father was here." And this, the badge, in her ash-covered hands. "This is something I have had since 1878. Since June of 1878. He had taken her father's badge, and kept it, and waited until now to give it back. As a message, she stood in the ruin of her cabin holding the badge for a long time. Then she closed her fist around it, put it in her coat pocket, not where it had been, closer, close to where her heart was. She walked out of the ash. She looked at Declan. "Can you ride?" she asked, to Helena. "Yes." "Then start tonight," she said. "I need those documents in federal hands before Brent takes his next step." "And you?" She looked at the mountain around her, at the dark timber and the granite and the cold sky, full of more stars than any city person could imagine, and the silence that was not empty but full of wind and distance, and the weight of everything that had happened here. "I'll be here," she said. "He's not done making mistakes, and I'm not done letting him." Declan nodded. He went to saddle his horse, and Wren stood on her mountain, in the ruin of the place she had built with her own hands, and she felt, beneath the cold and the grief and the particular anger that she kept controlled. Because controlled was the only kind that was useful, she felt something else, something her father would have recognized. The absolute stillness of a person who has run out of patience, not with the mountain, not with the work, with waiting. She was done waiting. Brent would come. She would be ready. And this time, when he walked onto Harrow Ridge, thinking he already knew how this ended, he would find out that he had been wrong about something very important. He had been wrong about how far Wren Callard's daughter was willing to go, and how long she had been planning it. The night after the cabin burned, Wren did not sleep, not because of grief, not because of fear, because there was too much to think about, and not enough time to think it in, and sleep was a resource she would spend later when the accounts were settled. She sat on a granite ledge above the ash, wrapped in a blanket, Winchester across her knees, the badge in her coat pocket, pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Declan had ridden south 2 hours ago, into the dark, toward Helena and the federal marshal's office, and the tin box full of 18 months of careful documentation. She had watched his horse disappear into the tree line and felt the specific weight of a thing committed to. No going back now. Not that there had been a going back for a long time. Fen was out there somewhere, not visible. not meant to be visible. That was the point of Fen. Soot was tied 30 yards back in a natural hollow, sheltered, out of sight from below, and Wren sat on her rock and watched the mountain breathe. Because mountains breathe, not the way people breathe, the way old things breathe, slowly, with absolute indifference to what is happening on their surface. The wind moves through the timber, and the snow shifts off the high branches, and the creek somewhere below adjusts its note, depending on the temperature and the ice forming at its edges. The mountain does not care that a woman's home has been burned, does not care that 2 men are dead because of what's underneath it. It just continues. Wren had always found that steadying rather than cold. Her father had told her once, on a night not unlike this one, that the land was the only honest thing in a dishonest world, that it could not lie, could not pretend, could not be bought or threatened into behaving differently than it was. The land simply was, and if you paid attention to it, really paid attention, without agenda, without wanting it to be something other than what it was, it would tell you everything you needed to know. She had been paying attention to Harrow Ridge for 4 months. She knew what it was telling her now. He is coming. Brent arrived on a Wednesday. She knew he was coming before she saw him, because Fen had spent 3 days in the lower timber watching the south approach, and on Tuesday night, a low whistle had come from the tree line below the burned cabin, 2 notes, falling, which was the signal they had agreed on. Tomorrow, she had used the night to finish the preparations. Not complicated preparations. Not the kind that require many people or many resources. The kind that require knowing your ground better than the person walking into it, which she did. 4 months of walking every inch of this mountain. Every approach, every sight line, every place where the terrain did something unexpected. The south meadow where the grass grew deep and hid the uneven ground beneath. The upper canyon approach where the echo of sound moved deceptively. The ledge on the western face that appeared to be a clear path and was, from the correct angle, completely visible to someone positioned on the eastern outcrop. She knew all of it. Brent did not know any of it. He had a terrain sketch made by a man who had been up here twice, in summer, without the current snowpack, without the 4 months of Wren's specific and deliberate attention layered over every feature of the map. So, his sketch was accurate as far as it went. It did not go far enough. They came at 10 in the morning, which surprised her slightly. She had expected earlier. Dawn, maybe, the cover of first light. But Brent was not a man who crept. That was the thing she had understood about him from the documents, from the Docklands, from Declan's accounting, from the way Crow had described him in the single honest sentence he'd offered on the dark trail. Brent believed he had already won. People who believe they have already won do not creep in at dawn. They arrive at a reasonable hour in daylight, like men inspecting their property. 8 riders, Brent and Crow at the front, 6 men behind, coming up the south trail at a deliberate pace, not fast and not slow, the pace of a column that expects no resistance. She watched them from the eastern outcrop, 400 yards out. Fen was in the North Canyon, already had been since before dawn, moving through the passage that no survey had ever found, positioning himself above the upper meadow exit before the column even left town. Nate Bridle was on the south trail 2 miles back, waiting for the signal. Wren waited. Let them come, 300 yards, 250. She could see Brent clearly now, the coat, the derby hat, something in his right hand that caught the light, the terrain sketch. He was consulting it, looking between the paper and the landscape with the expression of a man verifying. Crow rode to his left, not looking at the sketch, looking at the tree line, at the rocks, at every elevated position. Smart man. Too late, but smart. At 200 yards, Wren stood up. No sudden movement, just the decision to be visible. To step from behind the granite face where she had been invisible and become simply a person on a ledge. It took Crow 4 seconds to see her. It took Crow 1 more second to put his hand on Brent's arm. The column stopped. She looked down at them. 8 men on horseback, and her above them on the rock, and the mountain silent in every direction. She did not shout, because distance and terrain carried voices in unexpected directions up here, and she had no interest in performing this for anyone other than the people it concerned. She just waited, and Brent, after a moment, did something she had not entirely predicted. He smiled. He rode forward, not all the way, 50 yards from the base of the outcrop, close enough to talk at reasonable volume. Crow rode with him. The 6 men behind stayed where they were. Brent looked up at her. The smile was still there. The specific smile of a man who finds a situation less threatening than it is presenting itself. "Mrs. Callard," he said. She said nothing. "I understand you've had some difficulty with your property," he said. "Fire damage, trespassers. It's an unfortunate situation for a woman alone on a remote mountain." A pause. "My offer stands, $600. You could be in Billings before the next snowfall." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then you kept my father's badge for 5 years. Not anger, not accusation. Just a fact set down between them." Something moved through Brent's expression. Not regret, not shame, something colder. The expression of a man recalculating. "Your father," he said, "made a poor decision about who to trust." "He trusted you," she said. "You're right that it was poor." "He was a capable man," Brent said, and he sounded almost genuine about it. "I respected him. But capable men who make things complicated for other people create situations that," he paused, finding the word, "that resolve themselves. Resolve themselves." That was what he called it. She felt it move through her. Not heat, cold. The specific cold of hearing something named for what it actually was, for the first time by the person who did it. "Boyd wasn't complicated," she said. "Boyd was just curious." Brent said nothing. "He wrote a letter," she said, "to a law office. He was trying to help me. He didn't know enough about what he'd found to be dangerous. He was just asking questions." She looked at Brent steadily. "And you had him killed for it?" Brent studied her from horseback. "You can't prove any of that," he said. Quiet, almost gentle. "No," she said. "I can't prove it here." She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "But a federal marshal in Helena," she said, "is reading documentation right now that gets considerably closer to proof than anything Cord Whiting's inquest, managed in 1878. The smile went away. Just gone, like a lamp turned down. The face that was left was not ugly or monstrous. It was just a face. A man's ordinary face stripped of the careful construction he put over it in polite company. Evaluating, assessing, recalculating. "Vor," he said, not a question. "He's been on this mountain 18 months, she said. "You looked for him in every direction except the right one." Crow shifted in the saddle beside Brent. A small movement, but Wren caught it. Because Wren caught everything. "Take the offer," Brent said. "Lo now, the pleasantry entirely gone. Whatever Vor has is already in Helena," she said. "It left last night." Silence. Real silence. The kind where you can hear the wind in the high timber and the distant sound of a creek, and nothing human moving at all. Then Brent looked at Crow, and Crow looked at Wren. And something passed between the 4 of them in that silence that was not a word and did not need to be. It happened fast, and then very slow, and then fast again. Fast, Crow's hand moving. The draw already starting before the thought of it finished forming in whatever part of him made those decisions. Slow, the specific elongated moment when Wren saw it happening, and her own hand was already moving, and the world reduced itself to the geometry of 2 weapons, and the distance between them and the rock she was standing on, and every calculation her father had ever taught her about what happens in the fraction of a second before a gun clears a holster. Her father had been very clear about one thing. The person who wins is not always the person who draws faster. The person who wins is the person who made their decision before the other person made theirs. She had made her decision 3 days ago. The Winchester was already at her shoulder. 1 shot. Not at Crow's chest, at his right hand, at the gun in it. Because she needed him to survive, and she had the high ground, and the distance, and the absolute clarity of a person who has made their decision in advance, and is simply executing it now. The report cracked off the granite and went out into the mountain in every direction. Crow's gun hit the snow below the ledge. He looked at his hand, then at her, then at his hand again. The expression of a man confronting an outcome he had not calculated. "Left hand," she said. "Try the left hand and the next one goes through it too." He did not try the left hand. Below on the south trail, Nate Bridle heard the shot. That was the signal. He rode forward. The 6 men who had stayed back found themselves between a sheriff riding hard from the south, and something happening in the rocks above them they couldn't see clearly, and the sound of movement in the North Canyon that was Fen positioning, cutting the exit. 3 of them threw down their guns before Nate reached them. The other 3 took longer. Not much longer. Brent did not run. She had thought he might. had prepared for it, but he sat his horse and watched Crow with his shot hand, and watched his 6 men give up their weapons, and watched Nate Bridle ride into the meadow with the specific controlled fury of an 11-year careful man who had finally run out of careful. And he sat still, with the expression of a man who is rearranging something in his own head, accepting a new reality, fitting it to himself. She came down off the ledge. It took 4 minutes to descend. She did not hurry, because hurrying was for people who were not certain of the situation. She was certain. She walked across the snow to where Brent sat his horse, looked up at him. He looked down at her. "Dismount," she said. He dismounted. They stood 3 feet apart in the snow of her mountain, with the sound of Nate dealing with the others somewhere behind them, and Fen moving in the timber, and the world going on in its ordinary way, entirely indifferent to the specific gravity of this moment. She reached into her coat pocket, took out the badge, held it where he could see it. His eyes dropped to it, and she saw for just a second, behind the recalculation and the legal machinery already starting to run in his head, she saw something else. Something almost like surprise that she had it. "Where?" "You left it in the ash," she said, "which means at some point in the last 5 years you looked at it, you held it, you thought about what it meant." He said nothing. "I don't know what you thought," she said. "Maybe you thought about a man who trusted you and died for it. Maybe you thought about a surveyor named Reuben Sachs who never did anything to you. Maybe you thought about a young engineer in Butte who was just asking questions." She paused. "Or maybe you didn't think about any of them. Maybe it was just a piece of metal to you." A long silence. "But I need you to know," she said, "that you keeping this badge is the reason I came here. The letter my father left, it told me where to look. You keeping this badge told me that what I was looking for was real." He said nothing. She put the badge back in her pocket. "Nate," she said. Without raising her voice, he was already there. The arrest was quiet. That was the thing about it that she hadn't expected. She had carried this moment for 2 years as a thing of noise and confrontation, and the release of everything compressed. But when it came, it was quiet. 2 men with badges, Nate's real, Declan's former but present in the record, and a mountain that had been holding its breath for 5 years, exhaling without fanfare. Crow let Nate bind his hand. Didn't fight it, didn't say anything. He looked at Wren once, when they had him on his horse for the ride down. She looked back. Something passed between them that was not forgiveness, and was not resolution, and was not any of the clean words that people use for complicated things. It was just acknowledgement, that they had both been here, that it had gone the way it went. Then he looked away, and Nate led the horses down the south trail, and the mountain got quiet again. Fen came out of the timber an hour later. He didn't say anything about what had happened. He looked at the ash of the cabin, looked at the snow where the confrontation had been, looked at Wren. "North Canyon's clear," he said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. They stood there for a moment in the cold morning. "What happens now?" he said. She looked at the mountain, at the high ridge, at the granite dome on the north face where her father had hidden a notebook in a crevice and changed everything. "I build another cabin," she said. He looked at her. "Better than the first one," she said. "I know what I did wrong with the first one." He almost smiled. "Almost." "I'll help," he said. "I know," she said. Declan came back from Helena 3 weeks later. The documents were filed. The federal case was open. It would take time. These things always took time. But the record existed now, in a place Brent's lawyers couldn't touch. What happened in a federal court in 1884 or 1885 or however long it took was out of her hands. That was fine. The hands that needed to hold it were holding it. He rode up to the new cabin and dismounted and stood looking at it for a moment. She had improved on the design. Bigger, better positioned relative to the wind. A proper stone chimney that drew cleanly. 2 rooms instead of 1. Real furniture. "You built this since I left," he said. Fen helped still. She poured coffee. They sat at the table. The one she had built from pine board she'd planed herself on a cold afternoon, when the light was good and she had needed something to do with her hands. Declan wrapped his around the cup. Outside, the snow fell. Not heavily. Just enough to quiet the world. "What happened with Holler?" she said. "Resigned," Declan said, before Nate could move on him formally. "Rode south. I don't know where he went." She thought about that. Not with anger, just with the recognition that some things don't resolve neatly and that the absence of a neat resolution is not the same as failure. "Brent's lawyers are already in Helena," Declan said. It'll be a fight. Yes, she said. He has resources, even now, even with everything we have. I know. A silence. You're not worried, he said. Not a question. I am worried, she said. I'm also patient. He looked at her over his cup. Your father, he said, and stopped. She waited. Your father was one of the best men I ever knew, he said, in a specific way. Not perfect, he made mistakes, told the wrong man about a silver deposit, waited too long to act when the signs were clear. He was not a saint, a pause, but he was honest, and he was brave in the particular way of a man who is scared and does the thing anyway because it's the right thing. Declan looked at his hands. I carry the fact that I couldn't save him. I've carried it since 1878. I want you to know that. She was quiet for a moment. He didn't need saving, she said finally. He needed someone to make sure what he found mattered. What he died for mattered. And does it? She thought about the federal case open in Helena, about Brent in a jail cell, about Crow with his shot hand and the testimony he would give in exchange for the lighter sentence that was already being negotiated, about the documents in the tin box that were now part of an official record. Ask me in a year, she said, but the way she said it, not despair, not doubt, the tone of a woman who already knows the answer and is giving you the polite version. Spring came, slow and then all at once, the way spring comes at elevation. One morning there is still 2 feet of snow on the northern face, and by afternoon the southern slopes are running with meltwater, and the air smells like pine and wet earth, and the particular electric freshness that mountain spring has. Wren was on the granite dome when the first real warmth of the season came. Just standing there, no specific purpose, no task waiting. Just standing on the highest point of her land as the sun came over the eastern peaks and lit the whole valley below in gold. Soot was tied below. The new cabin was below. Declan's smoke was rising from his chimney a mile north. Somewhere in a federal court in Helena, a case was building. Somewhere south, a man named Aldous Brent was learning what it meant to be on the wrong side of documentation. She reached into her coat pocket, took out the badge, set it on the flat rock beside her. In the sun looked at it. Wren Callard, Texas Ranger, a man who had trusted the wrong person and paid for it and still, in the last entry of his field notebook, had managed to say, Wren will find this. She'll know what to do with it. She had found it. She had known. She picked the badge up again. Did not put it back in her pocket. She went back down to the cabin, into the single room she used as her main living space. To the mantel above the new fireplace stone, granite from the mountain itself, fitted carefully by her own hands over 3 cold January days. She set the badge on the mantel, not in her pocket, not hidden, not carried. Here, in the house on the mountain that was hers, where it could be seen, where it would be the first thing she looked at in the morning when the fire was lit and the last thing she looked at before she slept. Not because she needed to remember who he was. She had never forgotten. Because she wanted to remember who she was, who she had been raised to be, what she had been trusted to do, why she had come here, what she had found. Not just evidence, not just justice, not just the long-delayed accounting for 2 men who deserved better than what happened to them. She had found this mountain, this specific place on the earth that her father had walked before her, and Boyd had almost reached, and Declan had sheltered on through the long cold wait. She had found it and held it, and now it was hers in the only way that actually mattered. Not because a piece of paper said so, because she had earned it, because she knew every inch of it, because she would be here when the next winter came, and the one after, and the one after that. Outside, the meltwater ran down the southern face and gathered in the creek, and the creek ran down to the valley, and the valley spread out to the horizon in every direction, and the world was very large and very old and entirely indifferent. And on the mantel, in a cabin on Harrow Ridge, a Texas Ranger's badge caught the morning light and held it. The records show that Wren Callard filed a deed restriction on Harrow Ridge in the spring of 1884. The kind that cannot be undone by a sale, cannot be subdivided, cannot be mined. The kind that ties the land to a name and a name to the land for as long as the law holds. She never filed a mining claim. The silver stayed where it was. Some people in Ridgeback Creek thought that was the strangest part of the whole story. That a woman who'd risked everything to prove what was under that mountain had turned around and left it there. They didn't understand. The mountain was never about the silver. It was never about the money. It was about a man who had looked at a piece of land and seen something worth protecting, and had been killed for having the wrong partner when he tried to protect it. Wren protected it the way he would have, by staying, by being there, by making herself so thoroughly a part of that mountain that you could not take one without the other. And when the poachers came, and they still came, because there were always men who believed that a fence and a sign were suggestions rather than boundaries, they came across the wire and into the timber, and then they went very still, because there was something up there, not a ghost, not a curse, something much simpler and much harder to explain. A woman who knew the mountain better than they did, who had been there longer than they had, who had walked every inch of it, in every season and in every weather, and who moved through it like she was part of it, which she was. By that point, she was. They never saw her before she decided to let them see her. They never heard her before she decided to speak, and when she spoke, they listened. Because there are some voices you hear with your ears, and some you hear somewhere else entirely, somewhere older, somewhere that does not ask for proof or explanation, somewhere that just knows. Wren Callard's was that kind of voice. On Harrow Ridge, in the high timber, in the cold air, she was still there, and the mountain remembered her name.